Well, I'd like to welcome everyone again to the next session in the First Line Leader webinar series. Today's session is Why Are Managers and Human Resources So Disconnected? Again, we're so glad you could join us today. Today's facilitators are Brett Long and Donna Wright, and I'll introduce them now. Brett recently joined Creative Healthcare Management as a consultant after 20 years in health system leadership roles, most recently as Vice President of Strategy and Human Resources at one of the largest health systems in the Midwest. He is passionate about developing engaged, emotionally intelligent leaders who improve their own, their teams, and their organization's performance and well-being. He has sharp business savvy along with humble, authentic interest in partnering with others. He understands the nuts and bolts of how to build flourishing organizations in which teams engage, find meaning, experience purpose, and celebrate amazing accomplishments. Donna Wright is a professional development specialist with Creative Healthcare Management here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She has worked with many healthcare organizations around the world. She is the author of the books The Ultimate Guide to Competency Assessment in Healthcare, Competency Assessment Field Guide, and a contributor to the national award-winning book Relationship-Based Care, A Model for Transforming Practice. Donna has worked in both staff and leadership roles. Her experiences have taken her to a variety of healthcare settings, including rural Africa. Donna is a member and past president of the Association for Nursing Professional Development and a recipient of their Promoting Excellence in Consultation Award. I'd like to welcome Brett and Donna. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Chris. I'll get us started here. And our topic today is really looking at why is there a disconnect sometimes between managers and human resources. This sometimes occurs. We hear this time and time again where there's stories that pop up about this disconnect that occurs. Now, as we talk about this today, I'm going to be very clear. We're not taking sides. We are not saying this side or the other side is causing problems and this and that. We're going to look at this disconnect and understand how we can make a difference in coming together as partners in the work that we need to do in healthcare. So we're going to look realistically about the disconnect, and we're going to look at these situations and some possible solutions that we might have to create cultures of connection. Connections that are truly relationship-based. So we're going to look at both sides. We're going to keep talking about both the manager's point of view and the human resources specialist point of view. But our goal today is to really lift up and clarify that there's connection that needs to occur between these two groups or departments, and that we need to be able to work together collaboratively. So let's describe the realities that we sometimes encounter that may cause this disconnect. I've heard story after story from people of conversations that might go like this. Let's say a manager is having an issue or problem with an employee. People are saying they're not doing their job, they're not working out, this person's terrible. They have complaint after complaint. The manager's at their wit's end and they don't know what to do. So the manager calls up to Human Resources and says, Human Resources, this is a manager over in this department, and I have a question for you. I have an employee. They're not doing very good. They're just terrible. I mean, people don't like working with them. They don't do their job. They're just terrible. Can I fire that person? There's a long pause, and then the human resources person says, well, you got some documentation? I mean, you need to have some of this documented. Do you have some documentation? And the manager then again pauses and says, well, I wrote down a few things down on a Post-it note that says, you're terrible, or you're a problem. And then the human resources person says, no, that's not good enough. You need more documentation. You got to go out and get some documentation. You better have some of that, and then we'll talk. But you better get some documentation, and we can look at the problem and all of that. So here's where the conversation takes a break. Then the manager goes out, and they collect some documentation. They gather together data. 3 years later, they call back to Human Resources, and they say, I still have this employee here, and they're still a problem. Can I fire them now? I've documented some stuff. Can I do something now? And then Human Resources said something like, well, how much documentation do you have? And then the manager says, well, I have this much. And then Human Resources says, well, that's not enough. and they start to have this disconnect, and things just don't feel good. It doesn't feel right. Now, I think in our efforts to do what we need to do, there's a few mistakes that are happening on both sides here, obviously. But this situation is something that comes up time and time again. And as I look at the kind of disconnect between this, we need to look at what causes some of that disconnect. So let's look realistically about what gets in the way. We are not pointing fingers at one or the other saying if they would only do this, then I could do my job. We want to look at the assumptions that we have in these conversations, whether they're over the phone or by email or in person. What are the assumptions we bring to this equation? What do we have as our own assumptions for ourselves? What do we have as assumptions for the other group? And so let's take a look at the things that get in the way of creating possibly this disconnect. Because understanding the situation of where we're starting at can help us find solutions to where we need to go to be in a healthier place. So these are some things that might cause the disconnect. Maybe some of the things that we're starting to engage in as managers or as human resource specialists is really fear-driven responses. We're afraid of the situation, the employee, whatever it might be, but it's often fear-driven. Sometimes it's a lack of experience. We just haven't had to encounter much of this, and we don't even know where to start or begin. Whether we're in human resources or a manager, we might just not have that much experience to build on, so it's uncomfortable. Maybe we're litigation focused, afraid of being sued, or there might be some grievances or something else like that, and so we have a focus on litigation and protecting ourselves from litigation, which is a very valid point, but can sometimes consume us. Sometimes we also say, I'm ultimately responsible. I mean, I got to take care of this. So we feel this hyper sense of responsibility on either side of the equation. Or we say, but I'm the expert. I know what to do. And sometimes that can get in the way too. Sometimes we're saying, gosh, I just want to be liked and loved. I really want just my team to love me. I want people to like me, all that kind of thing. And that can get in the way and interfere with some of this, the actions that we take or cause the disconnect. Sometimes we're just uncomfortable. There's just a discomfort in having these conversations or talking about different things in this category. Sometimes we have a lack of confidence or clarity of our role, who we are, what our goals are, things like that. Sometimes in these discussions we're seeking the right answer, knowing that these situations, these conversations are complex, and there isn't always the answer or the one thing that's right. But instead, we need to look at, what options do we have and the pros and cons of each. But sometimes we're seeking for someone to just tell us what's the right answer. And sometimes we've just had some bad past experiences, things that caused us to remember that things can really go bad, or they can go toxic if we don't address something. It can be problematic, and it can cause a ripple effect on our whole team. Or sometimes if we jump too quickly, it can cause a bad response too. So we've just had some bad experiences. All of these things start to really build into the disconnect, but it's very important that we start at this point and say, how do we enter into this situation? How do I see myself? How do I see the other person? What are the assumptions we're entering into this conversation or this partnership that might create the disconnect? So in order to provide some connection, get away from the disconnect, we need to look at how to create a culture of connection. We believe that there's two main ways to look at this, and this will be the focal points of our webinar today, is really looking at, do I have an understanding of the relationships involved in this situation? Do I really have an understanding of this relationship, the relationships and the partnership that we're trying to establish, so we can truly have connectivity that leads to a partnership? And do I know how to make these connections happen, regardless of the role that I play in the situation? So as we talk about some of this today, again, Brett and I are going to very much emphasize that it doesn't matter on what side of this equation that you're on what relationship you're in, or what position you have. Anyone can make a difference in making connections. So we can't start by saying, if that other group would just be like this, if those people would just do like that, then I can do my job and I can be better. Any of us can start this. Any of us can create a culture of connection. It's not always easy, But once you have the information, you're armed with the right things, the right tools to be able to really construct and build wonderful connections. So let's take a look at that first question. Let's really take a look at, do I have an understanding of the relationships involved in this situation? So as we look at the relationships involved in this situation, there's three main relationships we're going to focus on that can create a culture of connectivity. The first relationship is, do I have a relationship of understanding myself? Do I really understand the assumptions in this relationship, in this conversation that I'm bringing to the equation? You know, my own fears and hopes and dreams and whatever. Do I understand that? And I think sometimes we avoid this because we don't want to come across being self-centered or selfish in this process. And that's not really what we're talking about. We're really talking about being self-aware. Are you aware of the fears and the hopes and the whatever that you might come, the assumptions that I talked about earlier? So that's one part of the relationship we need to look at. The second relationship we need to look at is, do I have an understanding of the other person? Do we understand each other? Sometimes we say, well, that person is like this, or they're doing this to me. That's not what I'm saying. I'm really saying, what are their hopes and fears and dreams in this too? That we all come with something. Are we really understanding the other person in this equation? As we're talking over the phone, as we're emailing back and forth, what are the key things to that other person and understanding them? Brene Brown mentions this as the core element of empathy, to really understand another and to walk in their shoes. Not just being sympathetic, but truly empathetic to the others. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to agree with each other's points, but we do need to enter into a curiosity and an empathy that helps us to respect each other in a mutual kind of way. And then the third relationship that we need to consider, and this is one that rarely enters into our conversation in our partnership between managers and human resources, is understanding the goal of what we're trying to accomplish and how it impacts the patient's situation. I think many times we talk about the employee if we're discussing an employee situation, and that's very healthy too. That's part of the goal of looking at how to develop an employee or respect an employee or counsel or coach an employee. But really, how does this impact, in the end, our mutual goal that we have of patient care? To look at an employee situation and to really understand how that impacts the patient, that can be an interesting part of the conversation that creates focus, that brings clarity like you've never believed before. So consider that as a third relationship in understanding and making connections happen between managers and human resources, is that the patient has to be a part of this equation at some fashion. And as you look at these three relationships, basically this is the core of relationship-based care. So if you're familiar with the concept of relationship-based care, you've already got a step forward in understanding how to apply this to the manager human resources connection. So let's take a look at that. For those of you who might not be familiar with relationship-based care, it's the same basic principle with a little different twist to it. But basically, if you're using relationship-based care components, this is not just about the patient and family. In relationship-based care is about three relationships: relationship with self, relationship with colleague, and relationship with patient and family. So in order for us to truly give excellent care to patients and family, to really create a healing environment, we need to understand ourselves. We need to know ourselves. We need to have clarity of our role in our profession and what we need to do in our job. We need to have clarity of ourselves as a person, as a human being. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to have an understanding of self. Relationship with self is the first step in really providing a healing, healthy environment. Then we also need to have a relationship with our coworkers. We do not do this work alone. We need to connect with other people. And to be honest with you, sometimes those people may irritate us. Sometimes it might be difficult to work with somebody. Sometimes we might not see things from the same point of view. But we need to enter into a mutual connectivity, a mutual relationship that allows us to connect with other people, to know that other people, to know that other person, to support them, to really see them as a part of the equation and work together in a collaborative way. So we need to come together as colleagues in a respectful way to look at how we can create that connectivity for the benefit of the patient. And then we need to have a relationship with the patient and family. we need to boldly step forward in our role and with each other to make that happen. So if you really look at this, relationship-based care is basically looking at self as strong, confident, competent, independent people who know themselves and take care of themselves and boldly step forward. And we then choose to connect with each other for the benefit of the patient and family. So if I were to put them in an order, I would say your relationship with self needs to start first, then you connect with colleagues, and then you can enter into that sacred space with the patient and family and help and care and serve them. So that's basically the core elements of relationship-based care. So now let's step back and look at this then. Take these relationship-based principles and put them into the connection between managers and human resources specialists. So if we look at the focus on self, and we're looking at how we can lead to healthier connections, here's some questions that can help you to really build that focus on self as you enter into a conversation with the other partner, whether it be a manager or human resources specialist. We need to ask ourselves, do I know what my needs are in this situation? What do I want out of this situation? What do I want to take away from it? I look at some of the things we've learned over the years from crucial conversations or from the different things of Stephen Covey's work and all that. What are my needs in this situation? And to really look at that. And then ask ourselves, not just in this situation, but in this encounter, in this one episode of conversation right now that I'm about to have with this potential partner, what are my hopes and dreams in this encounter? What do I want to come out of it? What is my broader picture and view of what I want to accomplish? I think sometimes we don't realize that. We just kind of dump our problem on somebody's doorstep, or we put a lot of our emotions that are upon us for the day, but we don't always talk about what we want from this encounter. And then what are actually my fears? What are my areas of discomfort that I don't want to go to that place? Because that can tell a lot about ourself and where we're at. Am I uncomfortable in this situation? Do I want to just give it away to somebody else? Where am I at right now? To have some honest conversations with yourself before you ever enter into a conversation with somebody else. So in focusing on self, do I know what my needs are? Do I know what my hopes and dreams are for this encounter? And do I know what my fears are in my areas of discomfort? So that's the first thing I would ask myself. Then the next questions I would ask would be related to my colleague. And as a manager or a human resources specialist, I would look to the other person now, and I would say, do I know what your needs are in this situation? What are you trying to accomplish from this situation? What are your overall goals that you're trying to look at? To really look at it from that other point of view, to really open up our minds, not make snap judgments about it, or from past bad experiences, I automatically label you as something. But what really are your needs in this situation? What do you need in this situation as we partner together? And then I'd ask the same question about in this encounter. As we just discussed this thing at this moment, what are your hopes and dreams? What are really the things that you have as your hopes and dreams of where you want to take this? And then also, what are your fears? What are your areas of discomfort? So that I'm aware that you are a human being in this equation, and I have to acknowledge that you have some areas that are going to make you uncomfortable, or maybe some fears that you have. The third set of questions we want to ask to make healthier connections is, again, the focus on the patient outcome. How does this situation impact the patient and family members? As I'm about to take some action or choose not to maybe take action in this situation, is this going to have an impact on the patient? I mean, I've looked at many situations in my past decision making around human resources issues, either as a manager or human resources specialist. And I said sometimes I probably made decisions to keep an employee in a role in a way that maybe was endangering the patient. In my efforts to develop the employee, I often did not take into consideration, would this put a patient or family member at jeopardy? Now, that doesn't mean I have to take harsh action with an employee. It means I have to consider, what do I need to do in that situation to maybe protect or create an environment of safety for the patient and family as I'm helping to support and develop an employee. So I really have to ask myself, one of the strongest questions is, in my discussion and dialogue, as I'm talking about some issue or discussing some human resources situation? Am I advocating for the patient and family in my dialogue and my actions? And what do I need to do to consider that and think about that? Because in the end, what we are doing is creating teams, strong teams, and team members that can provide that excellent patient outcome and patient engagement. So I constantly have to ask that question, and most of my conversations I've had in the past as a manager or as a human resources specialist, I'm not sure I did a very good job of considering all the way to the end the patient outcomes in that dialogue. And that's the question I think is very, very important, that really helps take managers and human resources to a common place, that we are really at a common place to understand what we're doing together and the reasons why we're doing that. Okay, so for us to do this, let's also look at some clarity around our roles as managers and human resources specialists. As we enter into these connections, I want to lift up some common stumbling blocks that we have that might cause some disconnection on either end. So let's look at the role of the manager. A manager, and I'm going to be quoting here Michael Cohen's book. He's got some wonderful things in his book called What You Accept is What You Teach. He's a wonderful human resources specialist, and he says the manager has the right to ask an employee to do anything as long as it fits these 5 things. You have the right to ask any employee to do anything as long as it's job-related, communicated, reasonable, legal, ethical, and safe, and non-discriminatory. People say, well, it's not in my job description. It doesn't matter. You can ask anybody to do anything as long as it's job-related, communicated, reasonable, legal, ethical, and safe, and non-discriminatory. Could I ask an employee to wipe up the spill on the floor in the hallway of our department? Yes, I could, because it's job-related. I communicated, it's reasonable, legal, ethical, and safe, and non-discriminatory. I could ask you to clean it up, even though they say, well, that's not in my job description. It doesn't matter. It has to do with patient safety or team safety. It has to do with creating a healthy environment or a safe environment. It's a reasonable request, things like that. I can ask you to do that. Could I ask you as an employee to wash my car? No, you can't, because it's not really job related unless you're in a car factory. But in a hospital, no, that's not something you could ask an employee to do because it wouldn't fit this criteria. So again, I start there because I think a lot of employees, a lot of managers don't always have a clear understanding of what the clarity of their role is. So I'll start with that basic understanding, is that we have the right to ask employees to do things, and we sometimes don't realize the premise behind that we have to think about. Now, when we have a situation where we have to take action with an employee situation, who has the right to take action? Who has the right to discipline somebody or even fire somebody? Who can take action? I ask this a lot. Is that the manager or is it human resources? And most of the time when I ask this question, there's a long pause. And people in the room who are on both sides of the equation aren't really sure. Who can take action? And I'll tell you, in all 50 states, the manager can legally take action. The manager can fire somebody. Yes, they can. So then I ask the question, well, then why do we need human resources? This is the question of the day. Why do we need human resources? Because I think people often think, well, I have to ask human resources for permission. May I fire somebody? No. Let's look at the role of human resources. Human resources plays the role of advocacy. Human resources is not really there to approve the manager's actions, but instead guide and affirm the actions. I'm not saying by any means that a manager should just take action by themselves. No. Please reach out to your human resources specialist always for every situation. But to ask the manager, to ask the human resources specialist as a manager, may I fire this employee? No, it's not a Simon Says game. It is about asking the right question. I need to take action, human resources specialist, and can you guide me on what are my options and what are the pros and cons of each of my options? That is a clear way to look at this. That puts you in a partnership of advocacy. I have heard too many people say that HR would not give me permission to fire somebody. You don't ask permission. You collaborate with them on what's the best action in this situation. And same with human resources. There have been many times I've said, well, you need to run that past me. Well, am I, as a human resources person, saying I'm not in partnership with you or I don't trust you, instead of saying, how can I help guide and affirm your action that are aligned with our organization's principles and values and policies? Yes, human resources might bring up some things that the manager never thought about before. Oh, I never thought about that. Yes, I need some documentation that looks like this, this, and this. We need those human resources specialists. This is a partnership. This is not an approval process. HR is your coach, your buddy, and your best friend. But ultimately, the manager is in the seat to make action. And we want to be able to do that in a way that's reflective and well thought through. So it then requires a partnership. And the bottom line, we must connect with each other. Managers and human resources must connect with each other. That starts with understanding the relationships in the situation. Do I understand you? Do you understand me? Do we understand the mutual purpose on why we're having this conversation? That's understanding the relationships. The second part of it is, do we know how to make these connections, regardless of what role we play in this situation? So I'm going to ask now for Brett to share with us some of the techniques that he's taught many groups on how to make these connections happen. Regardless of whether you're a manager or human resources specialist, we can make these connections happen. Brett, can you share with us some of your insight on these connections?
Thanks, Donna. Hello, all from sunny Minneapolis. Good to be with you. So, while Donna and I both know how critical it is to be sure that we, excuse me, clearly define the roles and responsibilities for both the operations leaders as well as HR, what we've seen is that's often more important and very foundational to this is how we as professionals approach our work with each other. So in other words, how we choose to be, quote unquote, in our working relationship. So as we go through the next 20 minutes or so of this content, I want you to think about a challenging situation that you've had in this domain. So if you're an HR leader, think about a challenging situation that you have with a hiring or operational leader. If you're an operational leader, think about a challenging situation that you've had with your HR partner, because I want you to use that as context as we go through these next several slides, so you can have this to anchor it with. So as we go through, we'll see as we articulate here on the next slide. So how do we want to be? How do we choose to be in this situation? So let me first just tell you a quick story about my own experience. So you need to know, first of all, that I come into this conversation like Donna does, having been both a customer of HR in my healthcare leader role, as well as an HR leader later in my career. So I was leading a strategy and growth team for a large integrated system here in Minnesota when the CEO asked if I'd take on a leadership of HR after the HR VP relocated and left our organization. So knowing that there was a strong team of directors in HR that had tremendous functional knowledge, I agreed. So in creating my first 90-day plan, I found very quickly that we needed to create a clear kind of centering purpose statement in HR that guided our work, because there were some different sort of philosophies and service standards that people had. So as I started having these conversations and interacted with the HR team members and the leadership team in HR, I felt this tension with how some of the team were describing their role as HR, how it fit within the organizational context. And then the tension with that and how I saw the role of an optimally performing HR function. And it came essentially down to one word, and that word was support. So as we discussed our roles, people sort of started framing this conversation in sort of black and white, sort of either or, in this either or frame. So they would say, do the operations leaders have the final say in a complex personnel decision, or do we? Or they would say, are we strategic leaders as HR? Are we strategic leaders in the organization? Or are we just support healthy organization. So I was interested in sort of this framing, first of all, kind of black and white, either or, but this notion of support or not support. So when pushed, of course, I said, well, in my vision and my view, anyone that's not touching the patient, adding value by creating that through the patient interaction, is, I guess, technically called support. And I'm not a clinician, and so I've been in a support sort of function my entire career. But I found that folks didn't like that. They did not, some of the folks didn't like to think of themselves as support. But at the end of the day, anyone in healthcare is, you're either directly caring for patients or you're supporting people that care for patients. And so it really was a helpful conversation and sort of underscores, I think, what Donna had mentioned and some of the underlying tension that happens about who's sort of in charge here, or who's the person that has the ultimate call in some of these decisions. And we like to frame it as not an either or, but an and that's where this partnership and relationships come in. So as you look at this, there's many models that we could use around better understanding healthy relationships, and we do understand, I think there's a growing understanding that healthy working relationships have a key in both individual and team as well as organizational performance, but it often gets a backseat to some of the more technical topics in healthcare. But as you reflect on that scenario that I asked you to sort of identify with and keep handy as we go through this content, if you consider what most contributed or what most contributes to this challenging situation, was it the actual technical issue or dispute, or was it really rooted in interpersonal dynamics? And what we find more often than not, it's the latter. So as we look here on the screen, we see this 4 elements of healthy interpersonal relationships. And again, we could look at a variety of models to describe this. You can see a lot of work in this regard from Gallup organization. There's also some pretty popular models like from Patrick Lencioni around the 5 dysfunctions of a team. But this is a model that we've used in our material that are really supportive of healthy relationships. And most all of the ones that we're familiar with have as a foundation basically trust and mutual respect. And so that's where we're going to go next, is dive a little bit more into trust. So what do we mean when we talk about trust? Well, what we define it as way beyond just trusting you to do what you say you're going to do. It certainly is that, but it's much more than that. We like to say it's also inclusive of vulnerability-based trust. So a much deeper level of trust, meaning that, in other words, I'm willing to admit when I make mistakes with you, or I'm willing to ask for help when I need it, or I'm willing to confront a colleague that isn't living up to our shared team agreements. So it's a really deep sort of foundational level of trust. But what does it take to get to that level of trust? Now, we certainly must be intentional about building relationships with those we work with by getting to know them personally and as people. So building relationships, of course, helps us give each other the benefit of the doubt and to not jump to conclusions about the intentions of others. But what is critical in this, even before that, is, or in addition to that, I would say, is to understand how we're approaching these relationships, which may not be something that we normally do, may not be natural. So let's think about this for a second as we go in and approach how we're showing up, how we're spending time with each other, how we approach relationships. So we like this model that comes from the Arbinger Institute, and they really suggest a very simple framework for assessing how we're approaching relationships. And we've affectionately called this the heart at war, heart at peace model. So the diagram on your screen that you see really emphasizes, if you'll see, there's a line that's goes right between the diagram and below the surface there are these ways of being. So the behaviors are what are visible, what shows up. It's how we interact with one another. But really, below the surface is the ways of being. And beneath those behaviors is that work, the ways of being, is really more critical than the actual behavior itself. And in fact, what's beneath our behaviors actually defines the meaning of the behavior. So for example, if we can say the right words to an individual or implement the right disciplinary process, and if it is clear in our nonverbal messages and our attitude that we do not actually respect the person or see them as people, even the right words or the right technique can have an actual dehumanizing or destructive result. So what we see here is these two processes. So we have a choice in our ways of being, and this comes out, I think, clearly, as Donna and I've seen in how folks approach any sort of team, sort of workplace team setting, is that we can see each other as people. So really understanding them completely, knowing what their needs are, what their hopes are, that we really try to understand their perspective and point of view, or we can see them as objects. So essentially seeing them as obstacles, sort of vehicles, things that that sort of get in the way. And so this is the concept of heart at war, heart at peace. So the first, seeing each other as people, is having a heart at peace when I enter into a conversation or a situation. Having a heart at war is really as I see folks as objects that I need to manipulate, really, to get to what I need. So this framework is really important as we approach our HR or our operation leaders as colleagues, so that we can think about this as we enter any conversation. So this can be used as you're coming into a singular event or conversation. I think it's also important to think about this just in general, about how am I approaching this person, maybe someone that I've had a continued or ongoing challenge with. Either their style is challenging for me, or I just am not able to communicate with them as easily as I am with others. Really to step back and think about, what's my contribution to this? So as we think about that and move into the next slide, the way for us to do that, if the concept of heart at war, heart at peace is maybe a little bit abstract, think about this. So how do I really approach folks that I'm working with? Or how do I know if I'm actually seeing them as a partner or a person? Well, here's a few things to consider, and this is based on the work from Mary Kolarutis and Michael Trout from See Me as a Person. So these 4 practices around how we interact with each other. So are you wondering about someone's point of view? Okay, so if you're challenging scenario that you're thinking about as we're discussing this, if that's with an HR colleague that you're having trouble sort of getting your point across, are you really wondering about what the challenge is with the HR person, or what they're thinking, or what they're worried about? Or are you really to a point where you want to just tell them, or you know what you want, you think it's right, and you're really wanting to just tell them or convince them of your point of view? Or you've got another of following versus driving. Are you really trying to follow and understand and to really be with them and understand their point of view? Or are you really just trying to drive your agenda? Okay, and these are sort of nuanced, somewhat sort of nuanced concepts. And the final one, holding versus pushing. So really giving space and time for you to discuss and be in this relationship and have understanding their point of view versus pushing and just trying to drive, again, your agenda. So as you think about this, what is helpful for us, and Donna had mentioned this, is that we all have, we're providing you with some tools and some concepts, some basic framework. But probably what we would say the most important thing for you to be thinking about right now is what is your role and how can you take the next step. So in this challenging scenario, for example, what is it that you are doing to contribute to the disconnect? And how can you remedy that? So often what we hear is, like Donna started off by saying, oh, if they would only figure it out, if HR would just figure it out and get their sort of act in order, then everything would be fine. Or conversely, if HR says, boy, our managers, if they would just document and not come to us, with all these problems, then life would be good. Well, I guess that's probably true in an ideal world, but we don't live in that world. So I think what's important for all of us is to really take ownership around our own piece in this and to say, I can take action. I can take action today. As soon as we get off this webinar at 1 o'clock, I can reach out and I can say what I need and be very clear about that, and also even address some of the things that I've done that might have contributed to a relationship that's gone sour. So this is based on Covey's work from 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, where he's got circle of influence in the center versus circle of concern. And the more we can stay within our circle of influence and using I statements, the more productive we will all be. So this is a great material and a really good framework for us to use as we work through this. So let's go finally to just a couple real practical action tips. So how do we build trusting partnerships with our colleagues? So on slide 26, I think it is. So we move through some abstract concepts and then now getting really clear about some specific things to do. So as we think about this notion of relationship and entering into a relationship and really partnership, here are some real specific things from my point of view as having been, again, a customer of HR in my executive roles as well as leading an HR team. Is the first thing is to spend time together, and to do that before there's a problem. You're going to spend time together, but have it not be focused on a crisis. So really get to know each other, personally. And by the way, when I've mentioned this before and people have said, boy, I don't have time for that. Well, I don't buy it. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. It can be over coffee, and you can ask just a couple probing questions, and you'll be shocked at how what you find out connects you to somebody else as a human being in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise. So simple questions like, hey, where'd you grow up? Or how many kids were in your family? Or what was it like, growing up in this state or in that city? I mean, just a few basic questions. I am always shocked at the simplicity of this, but yet how it has impressive return on your time. So spend time together. Again, just getting to know each other. Second is really understand each other's roles and talk about it. What is it that you believe that your role is and what your role is, for example, in onboarding someone, bringing on a new person, and what do you expect from your colleagues? So what do you expect if you're a hiring manager? What do you expect from HR in the onboarding process? And being very clear about that. So really understanding each other's roles. Number 3 is really always keep each other in the loop. No surprises. I had a boss that told me that once that stuck with me. He said, hey, I know you're busy, we're all busy, I just don't want to have any surprises. So keep people informed about key things and have a conversation about what those things actually are. The other one is to choose your battles. Distinguish what's really important from trivial, so you're not really bombarding each other, which makes it really challenging first to know what's important to the other person versus not. And the other is it just takes up a lot of time. And then the last one that's important, we think, is really don't jump to conclusions. So take time to be curious. And this one really comes from doing number one very well. So spending time together and getting to know people really dissipates the phenomenon of jumping to conclusions. So these are just a couple action tips that we suggest that you consider as you're trying to build your partnership with your colleagues, either in HR or as in operational leaders. So as we kind of wrap up, we're going to just summarize here. There's two really important components to this that Donna and I have discussed. The first is to understand your roles and your purpose. So there's a real technical element here that needs to get clarified. But again, what we've observed and what we've seen in this relationship between HR and operational leaders that's underlying all of that is to really have an understanding of the relationship and the degree of partnership necessary for good outcomes, both for your relationship and, as well as Donna had said, for the patient. So we'll move on, and if we'll take some questions. Actually, we've got some time built here for the next 7 or 8 minutes to respond to questions from folks. And again, as Chris mentioned, you can send those in the chat message, and we'll respond to those.
Yep.
Great. So I know that we also have some references, so I don't know if Donnie just want to advance to the references slide so people can see that those are available to folks after the fact to see what was referred to as we were presenting today. And so I do have some questions I'd like to read out here, if I may. First of all, are there other roles for human resources in supporting managers in a union environment? Could you please describe those?
Okay, let's see. Can you repeat that question again?
Sure. Are there other roles for human resources in supporting managers in a union environment?
Okay.
Please describe.
Yeah, well, I can take this one. I would say this. I get a lot of times the question, is there differences when you have a union involved and all of that? Generally, I say no. I think we want to believe that a union environment creates a whole nother feel. I think it has another component to it we have to think about. I mean, definitely be as aware of your union contracts as you are of your internal policies and philosophies. That's very important. And there are steps you need to follow that are congruent with union contracts. But overall, the overall approach to some of this disconnect does not change. I have found that some groups with or without unions are often fear-driven, and groups that don't have unions are fear-driven. I just think sometimes we use those categories as possibly deflecting some real issues underneath. So I just lift that up and say I just am very aware as a manager or human resources specialist of what my contracts say I need to do to be respectful to the employee in any kind of action, but it doesn't really change the overall effect of the partnership between HR and human resources.
Great, thanks. We have another one here. It is, I do not feel comfortable making some employee decisions related to problematic behaviors. What should I do?
Boy, not knowing exactly the role of this person, let's assume this is a hiring manager. We can't tell that, obviously. But I think this could be a conflict issue, a concern about how do this person get comfortable with dealing with difficult conversations to have. That's kind of what I'm reading into this. So, Donna, are you hearing it differently?
Well, I would think too. I mean, my first gut reaction for this one is I don't know if you ever feel comfortable about it. On either side, I hate them all. I mean, and I don't know if I ever want anybody to truly feel comfortable. You know, I don't want somebody to say, well, I have 55 employees so far, I fired 54, I'm getting quite comfortable with it. I mean, I don't think, I've had to do some interesting things as a leader, and I don't think comfort is the word that we want to reach as a goal. That's why I feel so strong that we've got to have a partnership, is that, you know, if you're uncomfortable, that's a natural feeling on either end of this dialogue. And pick up the phone and talk to each other. That no one should be doing this alone, ever. That's how I feel about it. But
yeah, and the point I think that's really important here is that it is a partnership, and this is where we definitely can be leaning on each other. So that is one, I would say, in my experience, one skill set that I've leaned on is the real skill and talent of my HR leader colleague at being really, I'd say, articulate and warm in how they deliver this sort of message or this sort of news to folks. So just always know that you've got someone to lean on, hopefully, in your organization.
And don't you think too, Brett, that sometimes even if you are comfortable, you know, you've had a situation similar to something in the past, to get a second perspective is so healthy. I just love, you know, because it's made me rethink some stuff. Oh yeah, I never thought about that. Because we can get into our own little kind of ruts, you know, in our brain too.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, here's another question. Could you explain more about the most helpful documentation to communicate performance expectations and needed improvement?
I'm going to let you take that one, Donna.
Okay, well, I would say this. I generally, I stick to some kind of model, and I'm just trying to pop in my head. There's a couple different ways to go about this, but when you document, you should always document. I usually look at 4 different areas. Is it a knowledge skill deficit? Ask that question first. Is it a systems issue? Do you have the right tools? You know, do you have the right equipment? Da da da. Ask that question. Ask the third question: is there a pattern of the behavior? Has this repeated itself multiple times? So it could be a behavioral attitude problem, and or is it just human error? And always ask those 4 questions in a comprehensive way. Don't just start with one and say, oh yeah, they need to be educated, you know, training and education and all that. You ask all 4 questions. Is there a knowledge deficit? Is there a systems issue? Is there an attitude or behavior issue? Or was this just human error? I always document in those 4 areas just to say I've thoroughly looked at all of those things. So that's probably the quickest, easiest way to just give the 5-second answer to what's the best way to document whenever you have an employee situation. So that's what I've used.
I guess one thing, Chris, and we have others, I assume, coming in, but just a quick piece on that also reframing this a bit as thinking about our work as development work, how we develop people and how we provide them feedback in terms of being even more effective, as opposed to just, you know, having it be sort of more punitive. I think it's important that we're as leaders, we try to get tools and the necessary skills to be developmental to our team, and to frame everything that we provide to them, feedback and, you know, formal performance reviews, or even better, doing it in real time, is that we think about it in terms of investing in them and in their development. So just another little color commentary to add to what Donna had said.
Great. Thanks, Brett. Thanks, Donna. So we're coming up to the top of the hour here, and to respect everybody's time, a couple slides ahead here, the next slide has got some contact information for Brett and Donna. And then I just wanted to make a note about the next session, or not the next sessions, but just a review of the sessions that we've had thus far. And we just want to thank you for participating in all of these sessions. And we hope you found them of value. And I just want to thank Brett and Donna for leading us in this discussion. And do you guys want to share anything else before we end here?
No, I would just say go out there and create partnerships and linkages everywhere you can. We're in this together.
Ditto. Thank you.
And thanks again, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you at one of our future webinar sessions and hope you have a great rest of your week.